Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Pond, awards editor of TheWrap, and we're so happy to have you here for our 2021 EMMY Contenders Showcase devoted to the composers on 7 different Netflix shows. We're going to be showing you some clips, and then we'll go into a conversation with the composers of Bridgerton, Jupiter's Legacy, Amend, High on the Hog, The Crown, David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planet, and The Queen's Gambit. To the audience, please participate in the live chat, share your thoughts about the conversation, and let us know where you're tuning in from. And before we introduce our composers, let's take a look at some clips.
Well done.
He's a beauty. I have Diana to thank.
No, I did nothing.
No, you spotted him, not me.
But you shot him, sir. And it wasn't an easy shot.
No.
It was brilliant.
The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. Your fathers succeeded. And today, you reap the fruits of that success.
Douglas makes his audience feel very comfortable about the 4th of July. He says the founding fathers were geniuses. They created this beautiful thing called the American Republic. It's a very calm opening. And then there's a moment where he says, "Pardon me."
Why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those who I represent, to do with your national independence? The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn.
So how do you feel in this place?
You told me that there's no amount of literature or reading or research that could help you fully understand what that journey was like, walking on these red clay roads, which I recognize that red dirt, this red clay from Georgia that we celebrate. And when we talk about the unspeakable voyage, so much of that story is the gruesome details that you just provided. But the latter half of that story, for me in this moment, is the one that I'm choosing to center on. And that is the story of our resilience.
We could pretend to form an attachment. With you on my arm, the world will believe I finally found my Duchess. Every presumptuous mother in town will leave me alone, and every suitor will be looking at you. You must know, men are always interested in a woman when they believe another, particularly a duke, to be interested as well.
You presume, Lady Whistler.
I presume surely must be precisely what we are. Me, unavailable. You, desirable.
I've traveled to every part of the globe. I've experienced the living world firsthand in all its variety and wonder. In truth, I couldn't imagine living my life in any other way. I've always had a passion to explore, to have adventures, to learn about the wilds beyond. And I'm still learning. As much now as I did when I was a boy.
Welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce Kris Bowers, the composer of Bridgerton, Stephanie Economou from Jupiter's Legacy, Osei Essed from Amend and High on the Hog, Martin Phipps from The Crown, Stephen Price from David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planet, and Carlos Rafael Rivera from The Queen's Gambit. Welcome, everybody, and congratulations on some great work this past year.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, Steve.
So let's start. I'm just curious for each of you, and we'll just go around the panel. I'm wondering, how did the show that you were working on affect the musical vocabulary that you used for it? And let's start with Kris. I mean, in some ways, this is a period piece, but it's also about an alternative past. So, how does that affect the vocabulary you use to write the score?
Yeah, I think that it really helped take away any rules as far as, trying to be time appropriate with the music. There was one of the first things that really helped with that were some of the pieces that Chris Van Dusen, the showrunner, had chosen as references for Simon and Daphne's theme. And the basic thing with that was that he chose these Ravel piano pieces, which for me already was outside of the realm of, what was time appropriate, essentially. And but it felt like it really made sense as far as like the romantic feeling that the show has and all these things. And the second thing that really helped that really was a big thing for the show itself was all the music that Alex Patsavas, the music supervisor, chose, all these covers, whether it was like the Duomo covers or Vitamin String Quartet or anything like that. These pop songs and these pop covers I think were helpful to start thinking about how I could maybe look at like pop music instrumentation and try to like steal some of those instrumentation aspects for how I wanted to orchestrate. So like thinking of the cello and bass as like, you know, members in like a pop group as opposed to, you know, sections in an orchestra or something like that. So I feel like those two things were things that were really helpful. Yeah.
Stephanie, I mean, Jupiter's Legacy on one level is a superhero series, and there's a long history of great superhero music. How did it affect, you know, what you were doing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So on the surface, it is this superhero narrative, but at the core of it, it truly is a family drama. So for me, you know, having this like older generation of superheroes, they're not like Superman. Like they're over 100 years old. They're kind of broken down. They all struggle with their personal relationships with their families and their kids. So for me, I kind of wanted to paint them or frame them what we consider to be that tropey superhero sound in scores. And when we see them fighting, it kind of feels that way. But then I tried to subvert that in the music because we often view them in these situations where they're really fragile and they're fractured. And so the score, while has those moments of kind of playing into the trope, I've really tried to subvert it and kind of show them in their more intimate moments. So their themes are playing on gamelons or like very fragile synths or pianos or harps. And, you know, coupled with that, Jupiter's Legacy is jumping time periods. So we're both in present day and we're in the 20s and 30s learning about the origins of these characters. So in present day, we have, you know, like industrial rock themes. There's like a lot more kind of like grungy, distorted synthy sorts of themes. And in the past, there are those same themes, but played, you know, with more acoustic instruments. So like small strings and things like that. It didn't lean too much into like the music of the 20s and 30s. It was really critical for the showrunner to not feel like we were just kind of suddenly being transported sonically. You know, the cinematography did that enough and the aspect ratio was all different in the past. So, you know, the scope and scale of the show were pretty nuts. So I needed the score to be able to kind of expand and contract within those boundaries there. So it was fun to like be able to experiment in all different styles, but ultimately having these themes weaving throughout all of these past and present timelines.
Osei, you have two shows here. Let's talk about High on the Hog first, because it's a documentary series about how African American food has influenced American cuisine, and of course, you know, so much of American music comes directly from African American music and African music. So, how did that influence what you were doing?
I mean, a great deal. There's obviously also, you know, to say African American music or African music is rather general. Obviously, it has to be. There's just so much. And when the show starts, we're in Africa, but it's a whole series. So any themes that I, you know, start out with have to then make their way into the new world. And then here in the US, we have all these regional sort of food cuisines that we're examining and like figuring out how they got here and figuring out how the music fits into those different regions while at the same time speaking across episodes was a challenge. But that was essentially, I just had to find a language that worked for that, and it took a little bit of experimenting, and once I found my voices, and I just moved forward. Right.
Your other show, Amend, is about the 14th Amendment. So obviously it's not as directly tied to a musical landscape, and it also uses a lot of source music. So how did you approach that one?
That one was equally tough. I mean, it was obviously interacting with source music is always a bit of a challenge, and especially when you're working across not just decades but centuries of history. So that one, I sort of had to work to figure out what elements in American music, like what represented an idea of America, and I guess institutional America in terms of textures and colors, and how to carry that across time while making it feel, while making rules for myself that didn't necessarily hem me in so that I couldn't use instrumentation across different time periods. So, figuring out what my instrumentation would be that I could carry across the whole series rather than having them fit into pockets of time was really, that was my first step in.
Martin, for The Crown, I mean, you were, I guess, the third composer to come in on that series. Was sort of the musical vocabulary already established, or are you able to take it in your own directions?
Hi, Steve. Yes, it was established, but I mean, the people went before me. Hans Zimmer, Lorne Balfe, Rupert Gregson-Williams, small struggling composers. Obviously, really, they struggled a little bit to make their mark on the show, I felt, and I thought I could do a lot better. No, it was really daunting, in fact, to take over from those guys. And I was, I'd never done that before. I'd never taken over someone else's show where the musical language had already been established. And that's quite a challenge in a way. But when I was approached about it, it was kind of clear with the reboot and the change of cast and the whole sort of quite unusual refresh that The Crown goes through every two seasons, that they wanted something a bit different. And so I had to work within the world that they'd set, but I was really keen to do what I think I can do well, and keep, and not just be copying them. And so that was the challenge for me.
Mm-hmm. Right. Stephen, for you, for the David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planet, we're so used to, we watch nature documentaries and the footage is so gorgeous, and we think, it's sort of, I would think, pushes you, I've got to write beautiful music to go with the beautiful images, but there's more going on than that in this one.
Yeah, and I think that was the daunting thing at the start, really, and that it was a very different sort of film from anything that Sir David has ever done, and it was very much his own personal kind of witness statement based on his 90 years on the planet and everything he's seen. And some of it goes pretty dark, and it was all delivered directly down the barrel of the camera in a way that he's never really done. So musically, I kind of wanted to honor that, really, and make it feel like the sort of music you would want. And I was kind of, at the very start of the project, kind of asking around everyone who works closely with him, kind of, what does he like? What sort of music does he really listen to? And it turned out it's chamber music. He's got this huge vinyl collection in his library full of chamber music through the ages. And so that immediately kind of set a kind of grouping that we would use. It was going to be a smaller, more intimate sort of thing than I and many others have done for other natural history shows, where it's more celebratory and sort of epic. So it was it was a really small hand-picked ensemble, strings and piano and various woodwind solos and a horn and a trumpet. And once I got that kind of scale, it was a matter of just working through the film and really just sticking with every word that David said, because he takes you on such a journey through the film. So it was it was a lot of fun to do, a bit of a challenge. It was great.
Right. So Carlos, how did you come up with the vocabulary for Queen's Gambit? I mean, my understanding is it started out perhaps being solo piano.
Yeah, that's right. And first of all, I'm so glad to be here. This is like the coolest panel to be on, so just want to put that out there now. I started with piano because Scott Frank wanted piano. He wanted just an exclusively piano score. And what we noticed pretty much at the onset is that piano wasn't going to work by episode 2, because our character had already left the orphanage, where it seemed like the piano color suited really well. But by the time she kind of gets adopted and the time she kind of moves into and starts growing as a character, it felt like the color had to be, increased. And so we started adding flutes, and specifically because the producer, I found out, liked flutes. So I started adding flutes as like the first color we started adding, because you want to get your cues approved. And then it's just started to grow into the orchestra. So, and the reason why it kind of sort of worked out is because during her stay at the orphanage, Beth's character, her reality is basically the color of piano. But every time she plays chess on the ceiling, she's looking up at the roof. It was a self-motivating thing to kind of make that world orchestral. Every time you're kind of alone in your bed as a kid, you're kind of dreaming for a great reality, and it's just like all this incredible thing. So I wanted the things in the ceiling to be fully orchestral. But one thing that started happening is as we started increasing the colors, is that to get her character to episode 7, to make that reality orchestral. So I had a goal to make the thing she envisioned as a kid to be the thing she grows up to be surrounded by. And so that was an internal motivator, as I said, to score. And I'm glad to be able to even talk about this because the director approved of these cues. Ideas like this don't happen and you just do it. You kind of have to get the director to approve it, or else I wouldn't get to talk about it. So.
Yeah, I would also think, chess is not an inherently cinematic game, and
oh my God,
viewers don't look at it and think, oh, look where she moved her rook, she's really in trouble, or oh, what a great move. I mean, in a way, it's kind of your job to tell us what these moves mean, because we're not really getting it explained and we don't necessarily catch it visually.
Yeah, that was really the hardest thing to get. Was the first game when I started scoring the actual game. I had pre-written a lot of music that ended up staying into the show, but the games, that was a real struggle. The first bit I did, I felt really good about. I sent it to the director and he's like, nope. And then I sent another bit and I sent it to the director for the same game, then revision 3, and then I got a call from him saying, Carlos, you're scoring the wrong story. And that's a note you want to pay attention to when you get it. So what ended up happening was that I started thinking about the context under which she was playing. And because there are 20 some odd games to score, I realized my first idea was to score just game music. Like every time we play, we're going to hear a kind of thing, but it didn't work, obviously. And Scott was reacting negatively to all that kind of attempt. So it was about understanding where Beth was. Is she going to play someone she's in like with or feels for? So Towns has a kind of music that she plays, and it sounds like if she's playing Beltic or if she's playing Benny, it's different kind of music because of the context under which she's playing. So that's what helped me kind of get through it and made it varied, so hopefully the audience would be involved while we're making the rook moves, as you were saying. Right. I'm still blown away that it worked at all, and it has to do a lot with Scott, because he really was very clear about it working, and he made sure it did, and I was along for the ride. That's what I feel sure about. So.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let's talk about that composer-director relationship, because obviously it can be, it can be very fruitful and it can be very frustrating for you guys. I mean, for any of the rest of you, and I open this up for everybody. I mean, was the relationship with the director, were there certain things, key notes that you got from the director that really, set you on the right course or changed what you were doing?
I think that one of the most useful things on the show that I was doing was just that recognition from someone where a piece of music that I hadn't necessarily recognized as being the core was actually the core. You write away and you think, oh, I think that bit's working. I'm not so sure about that bit. And sometimes it's someone else having the confidence that their feeling that something sums up what they were trying to say gives you the confidence to use that elsewhere in the film. And all of a sudden you find these threads that are appearing because of someone else's input. And that was really crucial on this. There was a piece that I wrote very early on for a sequence about Apollo 8, when we first saw the blue marble from space. And it was it's only a 2-minute little piece of music, but it ended up coming back quite a lot of times in the film, because it was something that seemed to land well with all the filmmakers. And I'm not sure if I'd have recognized that on my own without them, giving me that sort of feedback.
Well, I feel like each of these projects has specific requirements that, the score has to fit with. I mean, Stephanie, we were talking about how it's not really a superhero movie on series on one level, but you do have things that you have to score where there are fights going on full of explosions, and there's a big battle with 6 different superpowers, and all of which are pretty noisy, and you've got to find room in there somewhere for your music. I mean, how tricky is that?
Yeah, so when I started on Jupiter's Legacy, I came in at a very unique time in the project, which is very rare. They had very solid cuts of all 8 episodes by the time we were spotting, which, I mean, when does that ever happen? But that was great. That really worked to my advantage, because we could kind of plan out conceptual ideas later in the season, and then I could kind of unravel those and tease them earlier on. So we kind of had a plan for the score from the start. But I remember in the first spotting session for the first episode, we got to the end of the episode and there's this 8.5, 9 minute just straight action sequence. And I thought, Yeah, great. Just, what a way to start out in a first episode, right? You rarely do you ever get the chance to just like dip your toes in the water and start to experiment a little bit, just ease your way in. That wasn't like that in Jupiter's Legacy. But it was a fun undertaking because, even though the cut was great, that scene in particular just kept getting, trimmed and just frame by frame, just sort of whittled away at. And the visual effects kept coming in little by little. And, the sound effects, the sound designers were working endlessly on that sequence. So, my first pass of that cue, that 8-minute action sequence or whatever it ended up being, listening to the first version of it, it's all the music was there, like the shape was there. I tried to pay very careful attention to just pacing and how felt like we were ramping it up in the right points or breaking it down in the right points so that we could build it back up again. But as the rest of the picture got kind of colored in from all of these other people, the visual effects and the sound, I noticed that the score was getting sharper. It was getting more intense. It was getting like bolder and more aggressive. And I think that that's sort of the way things do happen. Like you get more inspired by all of these elements as they kind of sharpen in the end. And for me, because so much of this show is a family drama, as we said, I tried to find moments, even in a big action sequence, to carve out the emotional nature of it. So towards the end of the scene, when it feels really dire and desperate, you have like the parents looking at the kids and they don't know if they're going to survive. And in a moment where it feels like the tension is the most heightened, I chose to just completely peel it back. I got rid of all of the percussion, all of the big strings, and I just went with like a more atmospheric, ambient kind of feel with just high string chords, like spacious high string chords. And I think that served the narrative better, as opposed to just keeping pounding away. During an 8-minute action sequence, it felt like the best way to sort of shape the story in that sense. So I think finding those little moments to have the score take a step back and really address, it's not all what's happening on screen. There's a lot of levels. There's a lot more depth here. So that was kind of my approach with those big action sequences.
Yeah. I mean, sort of the opposite of that is something I think, Osei, you experienced, which is a lot of what you did is for people who are just talking to the camera. I mean, it's you have this, basically talking to the audience, and when you've got Mahershala Ali reciting Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, it's like, how do you find a place for music and figure out what's best to share the screen with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the challenge there is finding a way to simultaneously stay out of the way and sort of be part of his chorus, like make it feel as if you're egging him on, make it feel as if you're embedded with him. And I think that with documentary, a lot of the time that really is the challenge, is that people are saying things that you hopefully are interesting, but if they're saying them for an hour, someone's attention might waver. And if they're saying them for 6 hours or for 4 hours, it's a lot of time to listen to people talk. And at the same time, that you're making music that you want to help with the pacing and help keep things engaging. The thing that's happening is that people are talking, and that's the interesting part. And I get to be sneaky. I get to sneak underneath and kind of help tell that story and try and make what I'm saying as interesting, but not disparate from what's being from the story that's being told, essentially.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Kris, for you with Bridgerton, I mean, your music is in the mix along with actual classical, Bach and Vivaldi performed, sometimes on screen, and with these chamber music arrangements of Billie Eilish and Ariana Grande. I mean, how do you find your spot in there?
I mean, it's mostly, I feel like a lot of that work is done by Kris and the editors as they're working on each episode. They really, Kris had a really clear idea of what he wanted emotionally and where he wanted music to happen, and really it was just trying to figure out how to sit in that sound that was being created by those other elements that you mentioned. So having something that could feel like it made sense next to both of those things. And really that just came down to instrumentation and thinking about feel and tempo. And like, I don't know, I always feel like, especially like all of the pop covers, all of that music is like dance music. It's all social music we're supposed to like feel like we want to move to and things like that. And so with that in mind, you know, a lot of the classical pieces are things that we maybe don't know how to move to as much or as easily as Ariana Grande. So I feel like, you know, in that sense, with any of the score, trying to write things, especially anything that was during, you know, ball sequences or anything that we wanted to have some sort of pace to, having that be something that felt like I at least wanted to like move and dance to it. It was kind of a thing that helped me.
Yeah. Martin, I feel like, you know, this season of The Crown, you have, you know, sort of Princess Diana is certainly, you know, a huge entrance into this series. Was there a specific approach that you hit on for her? Because I know when she's first introduced, it's very subdued. I think it's just guitar.
Yeah, harp actually. Yeah.
Okay.
It's, I mean, yeah, what a character to score. I think, as with a lot of the stuff on the sort of on season 3 and 4 that I did, we tried to be a little understated when you might feel that it would be, you know, it would be a big moment. So the bigger the moment, quite often the less we played it, and in some of the smaller moments we played it big. She is, I mean, she is the 80s as far as I'm concerned. I grew up with her in the 80s, and she was a massive part of that. And therefore, although I didn't want to suddenly get all 80s synth about things, I did really want to kind of embody the breath of fresh air that she blew into this very sort of this establishment and this very uptight family setup that she entered. And so we had to find a way of doing that musically. And there were a couple of moments, sort of especially around the kind of Dimania real fan sequences that she's on a parade in Brisbane in episode 6, and there I got as bright and brash and sparkly as I could, I think, within the Crown world.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's the assassination of Lord Mountbatten, which is, I think, fairly early in the season, is a point where you have, you know, a lot of things going on simultaneously because it's cutting between several different things, and your job, I suppose, is to sort of to help tie them together and keep the tension going.
Yeah, I think that's a great sequence, which the Crown and Peter Morgan, its showrunner, does really well in, and in that sequence, he was guiding me to not to score the action or the tension of what was, you know, this potential assassination, this assassination that was about to happen. He was guiding me to really, for us as an audience, to step back and see the overview of these sequences together and pick up on the metaphor of the royal family were hunting and while being hunted by the IRA. And it's not about a will they, won't they moment. It's trying to see the enormity of this moment in time and what's about to happen there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, Stephen, let's go to you. I mean, I feel like, you know, the show is a combination of gorgeous photography, but at the heart, it's a very cautionary tale. So there's, you know, there is a certain, I suppose, you know, warning or even sadness in some of the music that you don't normally hear in this kind of project.
Yeah, and it was interesting recording it. One of the things when I wrote it, I kind of wrote it in sequence as the film ran through, because you kind of wanted to feel this sort of 3-part journey, really, from his excitement of being the young adventurer, you know, jetting around when planes were new and all that stuff, to his realization of what was happening. And when we recorded the score, we did it over 2 days. And by the end of day 1, we'd kind of reached the lowest point, you know, and the mood in the room, I think you can feel in the music that was recorded, because it just, everyone kind of followed this journey down. And there is something incredibly harrowing and upsetting about seeing this man that we've all watched on TV celebrating the natural world for years, really sort of admitting how terrible things are and how it's made him feel. the positive stuff that he wanted to put in the film came after. It was the fact that, you know, it's not all over and there are things that can be done, and we were very careful in the film to reflect that as well. And he actually came to the studio on the second day when we were recording the positive stuff and his kind of his hopes for the future, I think he called it. And it was kind of incredible to see him with the musicians, and he said a few words that day to a piece that's called "We Must Rewild the World." And I've never seen a group of musicians behave so differently before a take and after a take than they did with that. You know, he kind of inspired them to something way louder than we could ever use in the film, but it was incredible to see the effect he'd had on them all.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Carlos, for you, I mean, we talked about the chess matches, but I wonder, there are chess matches pretty much in every episode, and they're kind of keys. How do you keep them distinct while also sort of tying them together, I suppose?
Well, as I mentioned before, it was contextual, but at the same time, as we were kind of progressing through the episodes, the instrumentation got larger and larger. As a matter of fact, there's one definite tie. Her biggest opponent in episode 2, I think, was Beltic, and she had to win the Kentucky Championship. That's the exact same music I play when she's playing Borgoff at the end of episode 7. However, the difference is that by episode 7, it's fully orchestral. But that kind of really serious game kind of music does play when she, for the first time, with piano and just a little bit of orchestration, but not too much. So the idea was to kind of increase the colors as we went through every episode. But like I mentioned before as well, like, again, Benny was someone that she wanted to battle. She felt him like a personal nemesis, like a personal goal that she wanted to reach. And when she plays him, I don't know if it's episode 3 or so, but when she plays him in Vegas, it's like, it's battle music. And it's almost weird how going over the top tends to work to help emphasize what's happening, because these are two people just facing each other, moving wood, or pushing wood, as they say, across a board. To go along with that, in the final episode, one of the great things we did have is the collaboration of Wiley Stateman, who's a fantastic sound designer. And if you don't know who he is, look him up on IMDb. We call him Obi-Wan Kenobi. But there's a big moment towards the end when she actually has a big thing where she looks up and it feels almost like a superhero movie, where she discovers her powers, if you will. And then when we get to the actual game, she makes a move. But if you listen, it's like a whip. It, like the piece of wood just goes like this. But what Wiley does, he goes whoosh, like this massive whip sound that it's impossible, but that's why he's so brilliant. And it adds to the kind of energy that the music's doing. And it was one of the big factors to help us kind of differentiate the sort of story, is that I really love to get to collaborate with sound designers as to who takes over what part, because we also have a clock that's going on and a ticking, and the music has to kind of work with that, and you can't be having one tempo for every game. So we really had collaboration conversations about who would take over even during a queue. And anyway, I'm just obviously a big fan of Wiley Stateman, and I think that's why I'm here today.
Yeah. Well, let's go around and tell us what was your favorite piece of music, or the most satisfying piece of music that you wrote on this assignment. Kris?
Yeah, I think for me, it's tough to pick one, but I feel like the end of episode 1 for me is probably the biggest moment that I felt a sense of pride, primarily just because we recorded all this during the pandemic and had like everybody recording by themselves and layering it to make this full orchestral sound. And that was the first time that we had a moment where we would have something that was meant to feel as big as possible. And so I didn't really know if that would work. And so hearing that final version, and actually speaking to the flautist, Jerry, about it, she was saying how when she played with it, she actually felt really emotional, was moved to tears, primarily because she felt like she was playing with an orchestra for the first time since the pandemic started. And I think for the whole series, I just felt like, you know, I mean, it was in the middle of all of this stuff, and we're all dealing with all these personal things, and I'm asking these musicians to record themselves and like layer themselves a few times and also upload things to Dropbox, like all of this stuff, while like who knows what's going on in their personal lives, like given what was happening in my own. And so, you know, I think moments like that felt really pleasing just because it just felt as close as we could get to having a bunch of bodies in the room and hearing what that sounded like. Yeah, so I think the end of episode 1 was a moment for me.
Yeah. Stephanie, how about you?
Yeah, so in the penultimate episode of Jupiter's Legacy is kind of the big epic journey episode, and in the origin story in the 20s and 30s, where they go to an island and they face all sorts of challenges that they have to overcome. They don't really know why they're facing these challenges, but at the end they're granted their powers. And it was a really amazing and terrifying episode to score. It was about an hour long, and it had 52 minutes of score, and it had to be done in 10 days, and it's all important music, and we've all been there. But actually the final scene of the episode was one of those scenes that in the spotting session, I said to the showrunner and the producers, like, hey, listen, I just pitched to them. I was like, this scene is so wonderfully bizarre. They kind of just like walk through a portal and end up on the moon of Jupiter. And there's just no dialogue. It's like the space is it's crazy. It's nuts. And I loved it. And so I just sat there and I was like, what if we do something like, I feel like the music demands something just as bold as what you're doing here. Like, what if I write like a chorale, like a kind of requiem type of piece using the main theme of the show? And they're like, yeah, that's so great. Love it. Then 4 months later, I finally get to episode 7 and I'm like, oh no, what have I done? What have I sold them on? Can I actually do this? Can I pull this off? And then, after just like crawling out of the pit of self-loathing, sat down and just like had to get it done because that's what we have to do. But that piece ended up being the piece that I'm most proud of. And similar to Kris, obviously this was composed in the throes of lockdown. So I decided to write a chorale when there were no choirs being recorded, which was, great. But I called up the choir contractor and I said, can this really be done feasibly? And he said, I'll get you nine vocalists, all with great home studio setups, and they're great at engineering themselves. They have a good mic collection, and they multi-track themselves 6 times each. And I did something really terrible, which is I made them sing in Latin. So coupled with not being in the same room as the rest of their vocalists to play off of phrasing or emotional interpretation or dynamics, they're also singing in Latin. Because I had the idea, I thought, this is such a big moment in the series. I wanted to not just have them ooh and ah, the whole time. So I went back. Jupiter's Legacy is based on a comic book series by Mark Millar. So I went back to the original comic series and sourced his text and translated it into Latin. And that's what the choir is singing. And I just apologized to the vocalists. I'm like, I'm sorry. Listen, I think, it would be so great if we could do this in the same room. But this is what it is. And they sent all their takes back, and I sent it to my mixer, Scott Smith. And 30 minutes later, he sent back to me what is in the show. And it was just, I was totally blown away by just how deep and rich and 3-dimensional the sound was when they were all just recording to a track by themselves. It was unreal what they were able to accomplish in these circumstances. And, while I wish, we could have all been together, it's the one thing I think I took out of all of the struggles of last year was that we can still make music no matter how isolated we all are. So that was a highlight. That was a highlight for me, for sure.
Yeah. Osei, what were your, are there moments that stand out for you on both of your shows?
There are. I mean, I do have to say it's very hard for me to separate pieces of music within a larger body when everything speaks to itself. But one of the most fun, just initial things that I got to do for Highland to Hog was, I believe, episode 4, Texas, when we're getting into Texas, was to sort of recreate a cowboy feel, play with some steel guitar and banjo. It was just really, I grew up listening to cowboy music, so it's something that just felt right and really fun to respond to and create and live in that world. For Amend, there are probably too many moments for me to pick one out, so I won't.
Okay. Right. Martin, how about you on The Crown?
Well, yeah, just to go back to your previous point about process, Steve, I mean, with The Crown, there are lots of sort of big sequences that I wrote to picture, but then there's also a lot of sequences where in fact, what I did was write a whole kind of album's worth of material while they were filming and handed it over to them while they were editing. And actually probably my favorite moments are stuff that I didn't then write to the picture, but that they then took those tracks and put them on. And it sort of gave a really kind of organic feel. I mean, interestingly, one of the main characters in season 4 was Margaret Thatcher, and there was quite a lot of discussion about whether she should have a theme or whether we should try and do something specific for her. And it was quite complicated, really. I, like many people, I have quite an ambivalent relationship towards her, or feelings towards her. And she doesn't know who I am, but I know who she is. And it was like, it didn't feel right to actually give her own theme. But in the end, actually, I think probably one of my favorite sequences was a piece that I'd written, again, right at the beginning of the process, where she's firing her cabinet in season 2, and she comes back from Balmoral and does this, and it's every composer's dream. There's no dialogue, there's almost no sound effect at all, and it's just music as she slowly gets her pencil out of her drawer and ticks off the names as she dismisses each one of these tired old privileged white men, and I almost felt some love for her there in that moment, which was, it's quite dangerous, but that was my moment.
Right. Yeah. Stephen, was there a moment that stands out for you?
The moments I tend to remember are the ones I was most scared about, and it was definitely the end of the film. Was one of those things when you're talking to filmmakers early on about how we'll have all these threads, and at the end we'll pull them all together. And then the closer you get to that moment, the more scared you get, was that it won't work and these things won't come together. But it was one of those shows where it's been so beautifully put together by the filmmakers. So much of the work was done for me, and if I just followed the threads that they'd offered for me, it kind of did come together. And it's luckily when we got to the end and with a bit of back and forth from people, it felt like it landed. And at the sessions, it definitely felt that we'd found a way of summing up his words, which was the main job for me. But yeah, there were always frightening moments, those when you've made a promise to people and you then have to deliver it.
Yeah, right. Carlos, how about you?
The ending of the show itself, the last sequence is when she's walking through this park and watching older folk play chess. And I had written, the last 2 pieces of the show are the first 2 things I basically wrote before the screenplay was actually finished. I was basing it off the novel itself. And the main title it plays at the end, but it was one of the first things I wrote, and thank God got approved by Scott. And then it was that sequence in the novel. It plays very similarly, and that piece doesn't belong anywhere else in the show. And even as we started looking at dailies and when we started assembling it, it never felt like it didn't fit. And Scott never said, "I don't think so," which could have happened. But it felt like a breath of fresh air, and I'm just, I felt very lucky, as Stephen had mentioned, and also Martin, when you have that sequence where there's no dialogue, where things kind of just come together and it seems to fit. That piece really didn't change. It just got orchestrated, but that was basically it. So I'm excited that the first thing that I wrote kind of survived, which often, as we all know, isn't the case. So I think that's the reason. Those are the 2 pieces.
It's such a great piece, Carlos. Love it.
You.
Amazing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So a couple months ago, when the Oscars shortlist came out, we did a panel with some of the shortlisted composers, and that kind of turned into a discussion of inclusion and diversity in the world of composing. We had Terence Blanchard and Lolita Ritmanis were part of it, and I'm just wondering, for you guys, I mean, do you feel like there has been progress in making this world more accessible to women and people of color, and what remains to be done? And I'll open that up to anybody.
I can speak as the token lady composer, that yes, progress is certainly being made. I think we're seeing a lot of incredible decorated female composers, especially in the TV world, less so in film still, which I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Lolita Ritmanis is a great example of someone who has been pounding the pavement for years and years and years and is only finally getting recognition for her incredible contributions musically. I think there's been a lot of momentum, and there continues to be momentum for women in film music. But it's still not enough. Too many studios, their actions are performative. They don't, they say that they want to meet new talent or diverse talent, and they're simply just not putting in the work to do it. Others are doing a fantastic job of it. For me, I always think it's about transparency. So it's about really giving that time to people who look different in this industry, because that's what becomes most crucial to younger generations. You want younger women and younger people of color to see people that look like them doing something that they didn't even know they could do because they just haven't seen that before. The visibility simply is not there. So it's about people who are in positions of power who can offer that visibility and transparency to people who are effectively doing this and who are working at this and who are really talented. I think that's the most important thing that we can do, because it's not just about now, it's about shaping younger generations so that we don't have this stark, shocking percentage that we're all talking about. Like, why aren't there more women doing this? It's like, well, let's shape that. Let's reshape that for younger generations.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, Kris and Osei, was this a world that felt open to you when you got into it, or?
I don't know if I would use the term open. I mean, I definitely totally agree with what Stephanie just said, and feel like it's I feel like there is action being taken, and especially in this last year, I feel like with what's happened in our country, I feel like there's maybe been a bit more people like putting money where their mouth has been, as far as actually trying to put something actionable instead of some sort of band-aid or some sort of like initiative that then doesn't really, we don't see any fruits from it. But I feel like Stephanie was saying, the next generation is really where that I see that fracture still being an issue, where education systems are not accessible by so many people, or so many people don't think about trying to find a way to get into those spaces. Like, I think about the fact that in my high school, in my music school when I was in high school, and at Juilliard, I was one of maybe like 2 or 3 black kids in the jazz program. And then there was maybe always like 1 female in every year that I was in any of those ensembles. And that's still an issue. Like, I just did a concert with the All-Star LA jazz band maybe about a couple of years ago, and there's maybe 1 young woman in the band and 2 black kids in the band. And I was talking to the instructor about it, and he was saying that so much of that is the fact that when you get to a certain level, it's really because these kids had access to the best teachers, they had access to the best schools, they had access to an environment that made them feel like they could do this, an environment that made them feel like, they had a voice that was worth cultivating, all of these different things. And when you look at the comparative situation in any Black and brown community, usually those areas are not those are the areas where music education is taken away first, and never really supported. And so I feel like trying to find a way to connect to that education system feels like the thing that's really crucial and still is yet to be done in a really effective way, because we can create all these initiatives for people that are up and coming composers, but from my perspective, by the time you're a 20-something-year-old up and coming composer, if you're a person of color or a woman, you're probably one of few at that point, so it's really trying to get to the issue at the root of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Stephanie and Kris have pretty much said everything that's to be said about composers and music. I think it's really a much larger issue than our industry. I think it really extends to every single part of our society. The opportunities and the access that people of color, women have across all industries to become higher earners or to become creatives, it's very limited. And even though, for myself, I definitely find that though when first entering the industry, I was not really finding the opportunities I wanted. I was there, I was already of an age where this is what I was going to be doing in some way. And I think inspiring more people is one element, but also supporting people is probably the most important thing that needs to be done. And that goes for, children who want to be creatives or children who want to be bankers. I mean, just across all industries, it's, I think, an issue. So it's, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I know we could keep talking about these issues and many others, but I'm afraid we need to wrap it up. So thank you all for joining us. For the audience out there that's watching, thank you for joining us. It was great to have you all. You can also take advantage of our free trial TheWrap Pro to be the first to know about upcoming screenings, because we will be having a lot of them. And you can catch up on past screenings by visiting TheWrap.com and going to the screenings tab on the main navigation bar. Thanks for the great work and the great conversation.